Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. A couple of videos ago I asked you if you had some book recommendation requests, because I do like doing like book recommendations, but sometimes it's like really hard to come up with a topic. And I want to thank my booktube friend Jess from the channel Fit for Gaming, which I will link in the description of the video if you want to go check her out, which you absolutely should, because we have such similar reading taste. You will absolutely love her videos. So I want to thank her for suggesting a video which I want to do today, and that is recommending books that changed my brain chemistry. So I had a little bit of a think about this, because I don't always know what that means when people say it, but I came up with a couple of books I want to talk about today that were just really impactful for me and maybe even changed me as a person. So we're gonna talk about these books. I probably will not give you like very in-depth thoughts about them because there are quite a few, but I hope you get a good overview of like books that impacted me as a person, and maybe you want to go ahead and pick some of them up for yourself, which would be the reason why I do this video. So I want to start with non-fiction books, because I think that non-fiction books have this like special ability to be very life-changing and just give you a new perspective you have not considered before. And the first book I want to recommend is probably my favorite book of all time, and that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a memoir by a young Asian American woman who was sexually assaulted, and the way that she had to go through this like American court system because of that incident, and the way that was portrayed in the courtroom, in the media, and yeah, just how much inequality there still is when it comes to sexual violence, how the perpetrators get away with like very limited punishment, and it's just not justice. So I absolutely adore this book because it really shows you the different layers of rape culture, and I think if you're interested in that, it's just such a magnificent book. It is written in such an amazing way, and I especially want men to read this book, or just in general people who do not usually find themselves in the target demographic of sexual violence, so they can really understand what this is like and how this is a whole system. It's not just individuals, it is a whole system that is working towards this culture that allows rape to happen again and again and again and again. Next, we're going into a very different direction, but this book definitely is a lot. Know My Name is a lot too, but in a different way. This one is a manga called Barefoot Gen, especially the first volume of this manga series. And this is a manga that was created by a survivor of the atomic bombs that were that hit Japan, that were dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War. So this manga shows you kind of the like environment, the culture in Japan before the bombs dropped, and then kind of the aftermath in the following volumes. And I don't know, the way that you can see these horrors basically picture for picture in this manga is just so impactful, and I think nobody can read this and not be changed in a way. And I have always been against war, but this is just such a great depiction of why we should all be against war, why we should stop killing each other. And it's phenomenal, and I cannot really recommend this book in a way because it is so horrifying, and I think for many people this is like such nightmare material, but at the same time it is the lived experience of people, and it's so impactful. Then next, for the nonfiction, we have Educated by Tara Westover. This book changed my brain chemistry in a way, because this book deals with abuse in the family. It deals with the way that this family that our author grew up in was very, very religious, but in a way that they really hurt their children with it. They hurt their family with it, and it's just so horrifying. The family history that is portrayed here definitely is a lot. Again, this is not a happy read. This is a read that is disturbing in a way. Now, why did this change my brain chemistry? It's because Tara Westover talks about how calling out her family for the horrible things they have been doing, she was always construed as the problem. She was construed as the person who destroys the family. And even though my family is nowhere near as bad as that, luckily, that is still something that I have dealt with, that calling out my family for painful things, for hurting me, it has been received by a lot of my family members, as well as me being the problem, as me being the one to quote unquote destroy the family. And so reading this book and seeing how even with these horrible things going on, these family members could still tell her she was the problem, it just really changed my perspective and made me appreciate that she is definitely not the problem, and I am not the problem as well. Okay, next up we're going into some fiction, and this is more like literary fiction in a broader sense. So the first book I wanted to mention is And the Mountain Echoed. This is a book by Khaled Hosseini, and I must say that writing-wise and story-wise, I definitely preferred his other two books, but if we talk about changing my brain chemistry, this one definitely came to mind. In this book, we do have kind of more short stories. They're like interconnected short stories because the characters we see, they are all linked to each other in a way. But what really, really impacted me in this book, there is one story about helping people in war zones, about doctors going to these war zones to try to save lives. And this story was just so well written in the way it was done that I left this book thinking, you know what, I should do that. Like, I should go to these war-struck regions and I should try to save lives. And I've never had that before in a book. Now, obviously, I'm not a doctor, so I can't save anyone, but it was such a call to arms to again be against war, to be for the people, to be for saving people, and I just really appreciated that, and I had never experienced it in that same like way before. The next book on this list is Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng. This is a book I read quite recently, so I guess the changing of the brain chemistry might still be working a little bit as well. But again, this is a book about resistance. This is a book about family, protecting your family, and the way that there are forces in this world who want to take it all away from us. And I think especially with, the US election coming up and a lot of other elections around the world, some of them rigged, some of them not, we see that there are these forces who want to take our lives, our freedoms away from us, and it's really, really scary. And so this book just portrays one version of what this could look like, and I really appreciated it for that. Next up, we have another book that is very hard to recommend because it is horrifying, but at the same time, this is something that happen to people in this world, and that is The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. Colson Whitehead is one of my favorite authors. I think his writing is so gorgeous and impactful. And in The Nickel Boys, we follow a young boy. He's a good kid. He really is a good kid, but he is black, and because of like weird circumstances, he ends up in this facility that is meant to kind of like re-educate boys, and especially black boys. There is a white part and a black part to this school, and yeah, we see him be detained there, and it's just so horrible to know that these places actually existed. And we have a twist in this book, and this story is already so gut-wrenching because you see this like really good kid being sucked into this horrible environment and just really not able to get out of there. And then we get a twist at the end, and the way it is done, it is so profound. It is so profound. And we have this scene where a white person who pretended to be an ally to these black kids take up the gun and shoot them. And it is one of those moments that you have to experience with this book, the way it is written, the language that is used, just to show that, you know, people in power, you can't trust them. You can't trust them, especially if it is white people in power and you're not white. Next up, we have Pachinko. This is quite a different book. This is more historical fiction, and Pachinko is a book set in Korea and Japan. We're following a Korean family in the time after the Second World War. So this book again is about racism. It focuses in on the hate that Japanese people had for Korean people, and I just said after the Second World War, which is not correct. We start before, we see the time during, and then after the war, so around the Second World War. And we see the racism and the way that when we exclude certain groups of people from our society, what that does to them. And in this book we explore that in a very interesting way, because we have these two brothers where one is the promising one, the one where you think he can do great things, but he is eaten up by his internalized racism. And on the other hand, we have this boy who people don't really view as having a great future ahead of him. He's not really good at school, and he's kind of like, yeah, just, you know, just a boy. He's just a boy. He doesn't care about school. And we see how their life choices kind of influence what happens to them over their lives. And again, such an impactful look at the horrible things that come from things like racism and why we just need to stop. Okay, talking about the racism, the last book in this kind of category I wanted to mention is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is one of like my favorite like classics or modern classics or whatever it is that I have read. And in this book we follow a young black woman in the US in I think the 70s when this book was published, and she experiences something where she is basically sucked back in time into slavery times, where she saves a young white boy, and we explore their connection. And again, this book is just so powerful, and I think what this book does so incredibly well is to show the way that this like very strong black woman who is, you know, educated and smart and strong and amazing, but how her being sucked back into this oppressive time, how she has to adapt to survive, And I think that was such an interesting thing to explore. I think we can tell ourselves in so many situations in our lives that we would have done things differently, especially since I am a German, you know, there's always this like sense with a lot of Germans that they think if they had lived during the Second World War, they would have been the rebels, they would have stood up. But really, would you? Would you? And that's kind of like in a different way, but similarly explored in this book, the question of if you would have ended up in a situation from the past, would you really have done things differently, or would you just have been oppressed or forced by your circumstances, by your will to survive, to go along with it? And it is a very interesting question that is discussed in this book. I feel like this video is going to be longer than I thought, and I'm very sorry about that. I tried to hurry along a little bit with the next book. Now we're going into the fantasy section now, and the first book I wanted to mention is Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is one of my favorite fantasy books of all time, and again, this is a book that poses such interesting questions, but in this book we focus on the question of leadership, the question of who is a good ruler, who is a good person to lead a country, lead a nation, lead an empire, and is there such a thing at all? And I think this is again such an interesting question to pose. We have this story that is kind of inspired by Chinese history, where we see a country, an empire in disarray. The emperor dies and it's not really clear who is going to follow this. So there is like battles and people striving for power and rebellion, and the question is just who can fill this gap. And it is just so interesting, especially if you read the rest of the story as well, this question of if this one person who might be great for the job, if they go away, what happens after that? What happens after that? And yeah, it's just such a fascinating look at this question, especially in this first book, but then also leading a little bit through the series as well. Then we have the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, and honestly, if you've read the book, I don't know how it could not change your brain chemistry. Again, this is a book about racism in this world. However, it is not skin color, but a magical power to move the earth, to cause earth shakes and volcanoes to erupt and stuff like that. And we have these people with this power being oppressed in this world because people are just scared of them. And again, with the way, especially the first book, the 5th season, is told, I think it's so mind-bending, and we explore this world from such different perspectives. And it's just fantastic. It is just fantastic. And if you read the whole series, I think because people really don't like second person narration, I love second person narration. And the way why this is chosen for parts of this book, if you read the whole series, it's beautiful. Then we have Pat by Akwaeke Emezi. Pat is a very short book. It is YA. We follow a young trans girl who one day finds a monster that comes out of a painting of her mother's. And this story is so interesting because we're actually looking at a utopian society, a society where there is no more monsters. And the question that is posed in this book is, how can we preserve that? How can we make sure that the monsters never get back inside? And the thing is that the monsters in this case are actually oppressors, are actually people who hurt other people. And content warning for this book, there is sexual violence explored in this book as well. But it is so good. It is so good. And I think, you know, we live right now in a society where it is so much about fighting the monsters, but still looking at it and asking this question of when we get there, when we win against the monsters, how do we preserve that? And I just really like that perspective. Okay, the next bit I want to talk about is a short story. And I can't really talk about the short story without the movie, because I've seen the movie first and then read the short story. And so it is very much connected in my mind. The short story is called Story of Your Life, and the movie is, of course, Arrival. The short story was written by Chiang, which is an amazing voice when it comes to these more speculative sci-fi short stories. And in this short story, we see the world during kind of a first contact. There is kind of an alien force arriving on Earth, and we see a young scientist, a linguist, who is brought in to communicate with these aliens. And this book is about the choices we make in our lives. And it is about how pain is just the other side of love, of joy, of happiness. And how what we choose, if we don't choose pain, we don't choose love and happiness. And this book, like when I watched the movie, it's not a book, it's a short story. When I watched the movie for the first time, I cried so hard at the end, because again, this goes into like my weird family stuff, and I don't want to go into too much detail with that. But as a child of divorced parents who had a very ugly divorce, I grew up asking myself if I wasn't there, if I wasn't born, maybe my parents could have just split up way before all of that and just had their lives, and whether that would not have been better for them. And seeing this, seeing the pain that the main character chooses in this short story and in the movie to have that happiness, it just broke me. It really broke me, and I had to put myself back together afterwards. Okay, last but not least, I have two YA books I wanted to talk about. The first one being Perks of Being a Wallflower by Chboski. I feel like I don't talk about this book enough, but I also really need to do a reread of it. Again, this one is very much linked with the movie in my head, because I just think the movie is incredible as well. But this is a story about a young boy who struggles with his mental health, and the novel is actually written in letters, and we just see this boy dealing with his teenage years, with growing up. It's a coming of age novel, but what is at the core of this book is again a form of like sexual assault, of grooming. And there is just this quote at the end of the book when this character kind of accepts what has happened to him, and that is not all he is. And that quote, again, it broke me. It completely broke me. It was something I needed to hear in my life to move forward. Last but not least, I feel like I've talked a lot about like very deep stuff in this video. I don't know, like it just happens, I guess. The last book I wanted to talk about is different from that, and it is The Hunger Games. Now, why did The Hunger Games change my brain chemistry? It's quite simple, really, because at that point I had never had a book where I just sat down and I couldn't stop reading like I did with The Hunger Games. I read the first book in 2 days, I read the second book in 2 days, and I read the third book in 3 days, which is unheard of for me. I don't really have the like mental capacity to sit down and read and read and read. I always need breaks in between. With The Hunger Games, I don't need breaks. I don't need breaks. These books just suck me in. And I think when I read them the first time, the way that I could identify with Katniss as a main character, and again, her like weird thing that she kind of mixes up love with feeling sorry for someone, which is an issue I had as a teenager as well. it just hit me in all the right places, and also the way that the series explores PTSD, which honestly I have come to appreciate more and more with every reread of it, and just showing that in this context, yes, you could say there is romance in this book or in this series, but I would argue there is no room for romance. The romance maybe could happen afterwards, but this series is about survival and dealing with surviving. Okay, so that was a very long list. I would love to hear in the comments about books that have changed your brain chemistry and why. I hope you feel inspired to pick up some of these books, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!